In early September 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe reached a point where speed itself became a strategic dilemma. What had begun as a successful breakout from Normandy had transformed into a relentless pursuit, with German forces retreating faster than Allied planners had predicted. Roads were crowded with advancing columns, while reports from the front suggested resistance was thinning unevenly rather than disappearing altogether. It was in this atmosphere of momentum and uncertainty that Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced mounting pressure to decide whether the advance should be restrained or driven forward at full pace. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied ground forces in the north, argued that hesitation at this stage could squander a rare opportunity. The enemy, he believed, was off balance. If the Allies slowed down now, German forces might recover enough cohesion to rebuild defensive lines. Eisenhower listened carefully, aware that the decision before him was no longer purely tactical. It would shape the tempo of the entire campaign. Montgomery's case rested on urgency. German withdrawals, though chaotic, were not without intent. Each mile gained by the Allies shortened German supply lines and brought the front closer to terrain better suited for defense. Montgomery warned that delay would allow the enemy to trade space for time, regrouping behind rivers and fortified towns. Eisenhower understood the argument, but he also saw the risks. Allied supply systems were stretched to their limits. Fuel shortages loomed. Communications between rapidly advancing units were becoming strained. To push forward meant accepting logistical vulnerability and the possibility of local setbacks. Yet to slow down carried its own dangers. The German army, though weakened, was not finished. Eisenhower recognized that moments like this rarely offered perfect choices. They offered only chances that would not return. The discussion between Eisenhower and Montgomery reflected deeper differences in command philosophy. Montgomery favored deliberate concentration of force, but believed that concentration now demanded speed. Eisenhower, responsible for the cohesion of a multinational alliance, worried about imbalance. An advance pushed too aggressively in one sector could expose others. Yet the reports arriving daily suggested that German resistance was uneven and reactive. Opportunities were opening faster than Allied doctrine had prepared for. Eisenhower weighed these realities against the broader strategic picture. The war in Western Europe was not being won inch by inch, but mile by mile, and momentum was becoming its own weapon. Ultimately, Eisenhower chose to accept the risk. The advance would continue. Orders emphasized maintaining pressure on retreating German forces rather than pausing to consolidate every gain. Montgomery interpreted the decision as confirmation that speed was now essential. Allied formations pressed forward, often operating at the edge of their supply limits. The choice was not reckless, but it was bold. Eisenhower made clear that flexibility would be required. If resistance hardened or logistics failed, adjustments would follow. But for the moment, the priority was to keep the enemy moving backward. This decision marked a turning point in the campaign. The Allies were no longer simply exploiting success, they were committing to it. The risks were real. Overextended units could be isolated. Supply failures could stall advances at critical moments. Yet Eisenhower believed that hesitation would prove even more costly. Montgomery shared that belief, convinced that German command structures were too damaged to respond effectively if pressured relentlessly. Together, they accepted that the coming days would test the limits of Allied coordination, endurance, and judgment. The order to move now was not born of confidence alone, but of calculation. Eisenhower and Montgomery understood that war rarely rewarded caution at moments of enemy weakness. The decision to push forward despite the risks reflected a shared assessment. The opportunity before them was fleeting. Whether it would lead to decisive victory or unforeseen strain remained uncertain. What was clear was that the campaign had entered a phase where delay itself carried danger, and momentum, once lost, might never be regained. As the decision to push forward took effect, the consequences were felt almost immediately across the Allied front. Armored and mechanized units surged ahead, often advancing faster than supply officers considered sustainable. Fuel convoys raced to keep pace, while engineers worked around the clock to repair bridges and roads damaged by retreating German forces. Reports reaching Eisenhower reflected both success and strain. Entire German rear areas were overrun before defenses could be organized, yet Allied formations increasingly operated at the edge of their logistical reach. Montgomery monitored the northern sector closely, convinced that relentless pressure was preventing the Germans from stabilizing their retreat. Eisenhower, however, was acutely aware that momentum carried a price. Every mile gained increased the difficulty of coordination, communication, and resupply. The advance was working, but it was also exposing vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. German reactions confirmed both men's fears and hopes. In many areas, resistance remained fragmented. Units fell back without orders, abandoning equipment and positions that might have delayed the Allies weeks earlier. Yet elsewhere, German commanders began improvising defensive stands, exploiting rivers, urban centers, and narrow road networks to slow the pursuit. These local actions rarely halted the advance, but they inflicted casualties and disrupted timetables. Eisenhower recognized that the enemy was learning how to fight while retreating. Montgomery interpreted this differently. To him, such resistance was proof that German forces were reacting rather than planning. They were being forced to fight on Allied terms, not their own. The faster the pressure was maintained, the less time the Germans had to coordinate anything resembling a coherent defense. Within Allied headquarters, the debate over risk did not disappear. Logistics officers warned that fuel shortages could bring entire spearheads to a standstill. Intelligence analysts cautioned that German forces were withdrawing toward terrain that favored defense. Eisenhower weighed these warnings carefully, but he did not reverse course. He believed that slowing the advance now would squander the advantage gained through speed. Montgomery reinforced this view, arguing that German morale was visibly deteriorating. Prisoner interrogations spoke of confusion, exhaustion, and a loss of confidence in higher command. Every pause, Montgomery insisted, gave the enemy time to recover psychologically as well as militarily. At the same time, Eisenhower adjusted the framework of the advance. While pressure would be maintained, commanders were instructed to remain flexible and avoid unnecessary exposure. The goal was not reckless pursuit, but controlled momentum. Eisenhower emphasized coordination between adjacent units to prevent dangerous gaps from opening along the front. Montgomery, though focused on maintaining speed, accepted the need for balance. Both men understood that the advance could not be sustained indefinitely without recalibration. The challenge was to exploit German weakness without creating Allied fragility. By mid-September, the results of the decision were undeniable. Large portions of France were liberated in days rather than weeks. German command structures in the West continued to unravel under constant pressure. Yet signs of strain within Allied forces were becoming harder to ignore. Supply depots lagged behind the front. Fuel rationing became routine in some units. Eisenhower recognized that the window for pure pursuit was beginning to close. Montgomery, too, saw that the character of the campaign was shifting. The Germans were retreating toward lines they intended to hold, not merely abandon. The choice to move now had delivered momentum, but it had also accelerated the transition into a new phase of the war. Eisenhower and Montgomery had pushed the advance to its practical limits, forcing the enemy to retreat faster than planned. The risks they accepted were real, and their consequences were unfolding in real time. Yet both men remained convinced that the decision had been necessary. Opportunity in war was measured not only by success, but by timing. Delay would have allowed the enemy to recover initiative. Speed denied him that chance. As the front pressed eastward, Eisenhower understood that the balance between momentum and sustainability would soon require adjustment. Montgomery understood it as well. The decision to push forward had achieved its purpose. It had kept the enemy off balance. What followed would determine whether that advantage could be transformed into lasting success. As the advance continued, the limits of speed became increasingly apparent. Allied spearheads that had raced forward now found themselves confronting terrain and resistance that demanded a different approach. Rivers, narrow road networks, and urban choke points slowed movement, forcing commanders to pause and reorganize. Eisenhower observed that the character of the campaign was shifting from pursuit to pressure. The Germans were no longer simply fleeing, they were choosing where to fight. Montgomery saw this development as inevitable. He had never expected the retreat to remain disorderly indefinitely. The purpose of pushing hard had been to force the enemy into this position sooner, before he could fully recover. From Montgomery's perspective, the advance had achieved exactly that. The Germans were being compelled to stand and fight under unfavorable conditions. Eisenhower, however, remained focused on the broader consequences. Reports from the front revealed growing disparities between units that had advanced rapidly and those still catching up. Supply lines were uneven, and coordination across the front required constant adjustment. The risks he had accepted were now materializing in manageable but undeniable ways. Isolated German counterattacks struck at exposed Allied units, rarely achieving major success, but reminding commanders that the enemy was still capable of inflicting damage. Eisenhower saw these actions as warnings. Momentum could not substitute for preparation indefinitely. Montgomery acknowledged the danger, but he argued that these counterattacks were signs of desperation rather than recovery. The Germans were reacting piecemeal, not executing a coherent strategy. That distinction mattered. The debate between speed and control resurfaced in practical decisions. Should armored units press ahead to seize crossings and key towns, or wait for infantry and supply columns to close the gaps? Montgomery leaned toward continued pressure, believing that hesitation would allow the enemy to consolidate. Eisenhower favored selective restraint, insisting that advances be supported and coordinated. Their positions were not opposites, but points on the same spectrum. Both men agreed that the advance must continue. The disagreement lay in how tightly it should be regulated. Eisenhower's authority as supreme commander ultimately shaped the balance. Speed would be maintained where feasible, but not at the cost of cohesion. German resistance hardened as expected. Defensive positions along rivers and near major towns were contested fiercely, slowing Allied progress and increasing casualties. Eisenhower recognized that the opportunity created by rapid pursuit was closing. The campaign was entering a phase that would demand endurance rather than acceleration. Montgomery accepted this shift with less enthusiasm, but no surprise. He believed the advance had already achieved its most critical objective, denying the enemy the time needed to rebuild a stable front. What followed would be costly, but it would unfold on terms shaped by Allied initiative rather than German design. By late September, the consequences of the decision to move now were fully visible. The Allies had liberated vast territory, disrupted German command structures, and maintained the initiative. They had also stretched their logistical systems and exposed themselves to localized setbacks. Eisenhower viewed this outcome as confirmation of the inherent trade-offs of command. No decision of this magnitude could be free of risk. Montgomery saw it as validation of decisive action. The advance had not been flawless, but it had been effective. The pressure exerted during this period influenced every subsequent phase of the campaign. German forces, forced into premature defensive positions, lacked the reserves and coordination to mount sustained counteroffensives. Eisenhower understood that this advantage would matter in the months ahead, particularly as the war moved closer to Germany itself. Montgomery believed that without the decision to push forward, the enemy might have stabilized far earlier. Both men agreed on one point: hesitation at that moment would have altered the campaign for the worse. The choice to move now had reshaped the battlefield. It had compressed timelines, forced decisions, and narrowed the enemy's options. As the war entered its next phase, Eisenhower and Montgomery confronted the consequences of their choice with clear eyes. Speed had delivered opportunity, Control would now determine how that opportunity was used. By the time autumn settled over Western Europe, the effects of Eisenhower and Montgomery's decision were no longer abstract. The rapid advance had run its course, and the war had entered a phase defined by resistance rather than retreat. German forces, though battered and depleted, were now fighting from positions chosen out of necessity rather than preference. Rivers, fortified towns, and natural barriers became focal points of stubborn defense. Eisenhower saw this as the inevitable outcome of the pursuit. The enemy had been forced to abandon vast territory, but he had not been destroyed. What mattered now was that German commanders were fighting under pressure, without the time or preparation they would have preferred. Montgomery, surveying the same landscape, believed this confirmed the wisdom of pushing hard when the opportunity arose. The advance had denied the Germans the chance to rebuild a coherent defensive system farther west. For Eisenhower, the transition brought a renewed emphasis on balance. The speed that had driven success in September could no longer be sustained indefinitely. Supply lines required consolidation, coordination between Allied armies had to be tightened, and expectations needed adjustment. The campaign was no longer about outrunning the enemy, but about breaking him methodically. Eisenhower understood that some would later question whether the risks taken during the pursuit had been justified. He accepted that debate as unavoidable. What mattered was that the Allies now faced a weakened opponent, forced into resistance sooner than anticipated. Montgomery shared this assessment, though he remained convinced that any slowing earlier would have carried greater danger. The window for decisive action had been narrow, and they had acted while it was open. Looking back, the decision to move now stood as one of the defining judgments of the Western campaign. It demonstrated how leadership at the highest level required acceptance of uncertainty. Eisenhower had chosen to press forward knowing the risks, not because he underestimated them, but because he judged the alternative to be worse. Montgomery had supported that judgment because it aligned with his belief in exploiting enemy weakness relentlessly. Their cooperation during this period was not without tension, but it was grounded in a shared understanding of the stakes. The advance across France was not a matter of routine planning. It was a moment when hesitation could have reshaped the war. The consequences of that choice extended beyond the immediate battlefield. German forces, deprived of time and space, entered the later stages of the war at a disadvantage that could not be reversed. Eisenhower recognized that while speed alone did not win wars, it could determine the conditions under which wars were fought. Montgomery believed that those conditions now favored the Allies decisively. The risks they had taken had not disappeared. They had been managed, absorbed, and transformed into pressure the enemy could not escape. As winter approached, the Allied armies prepared for the hardest fighting still to come. The advance that had begun with bold momentum now demanded endurance and coordination. Eisenhower and Montgomery both understood that the war's outcome would be decided not by a single decision, but by the accumulation of such moments. The choice to push forward despite the risks had been one of them. It had compressed the campaign, strained the Allies, and unsettled the enemy. It had also ensured that the initiative remained firmly in Allied hands. In the end, the order to move now was neither reckless nor inevitable. It was a calculated gamble made under extraordinary circumstances. Eisenhower and Montgomery accepted that responsibility fully. The advance it unleashed reshaped the Western Front and set the terms for the final phase of the war in Europe. The risks had been real, so were the rewards. And in the balance between caution and action, they had chosen action, at a moment when delay might have changed everything.